She stood alone in the darkened kitchen at midnight, whispering happy birthday to a gas station cupcake, her voice cracking on words no one was ever meant to hear. The pale glow of a single candle caught the faded freckles across her nose, the silver strands woven through her auburn hair, marks of grief that had no business being on a 27-year-old face. That's when he appeared. Dominic Moretti, the man they called the Reaper, the most powerful mafia boss in New York, her employer. He stood in the doorway like a shadow given form, watching her with eyes that had witnessed men fall to their knees and beg for mercy. But when he looked at her, at the trembling curve of her shoulders, at the storm-gray eyes now wide with terror, something shifted. "Come here," he commanded, his voice soft as a threat. Her hands shook. 3 years she had kept herself invisible in his mansion. 3 years of silence, safety, survival. Now he had seen her, and when she tried to run, when she stammered apologies and reached for the door, he did something that changed everything. He relit her candle. "Make a wish," he whispered. "This time, you're not alone." What he didn't know, she was hiding a secret that could destroy them both. Beneath her uniform, hidden against her heart, a silver locket held the photograph of a 16-year-old girl, a sister she had failed to save, a ghost that haunted every breath she took. And Dominic Moretti had just made the worst mistake of his life. He had looked at her, truly looked, and neither of them would ever be the same. If you are listening to this and feel that the story touches something quiet and unspoken inside you, take a moment to subscribe to our channel, to like and share this video so we can continue bringing heartfelt stories every single day. And if it is not too much to ask, tell me where you are watching from, and leave a comment below so we know which corner of the world this story has reached, because we treasure every word you share with us. Sienna stood there, her feet rooted to the cold granite floor as if they had been nailed in place, the tiny candle still burning, its wavering flame reflected in the storm-washed gray blue of her eyes, and she could not understand why the most powerful man in New York would do something like this. Her hand moved of its own accord, smoothing down the front of her apron. An old habit, a small defense she had built for herself over so many years. Bow your head, make yourself small, disappear. But his low voice rolled through the dark kitchen, giving her no chance to vanish. "Look at me." It was an order, not a request, not a suggestion. Sienna swallowed, her throat dry and bitter, and slowly, as if every single centimeter was its own battle, she lifted her head. Her gaze met his, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to stop spinning. Dominic Moretti's eyes were black as tar, deep as a bottomless pit, the eyes of a man who had seen death, who had ordered men killed, who had watched them fall to their knees and beg for mercy without ever flinching. But when he looked into her storm-colored gray-blue eyes, he saw something that unsettled him. It was not pure fear. There was fear, yes, but beneath it he saw pain, the exhaustion of someone who had lost too much, fought for too long, fallen too many times until she no longer had the strength to rise. Those eyes were far older than her 27 years. Dominic tilted his head slightly, studying her as if she were a riddle he had never encountered before. "Why were you singing alone in the dark?" The question hung a moment between them. Sienna pressed her lips together, her heart pounding wildly against her ribs. She could lie. She could invent some harmless excuse, but under that unblinking gaze she found that she could not. "Today is my birthday, sir," she whispered. "Or rather, it was 13 minutes ago." Dominic said nothing. He looked down at the cupcake now sitting on the counter, the candle still burning, the frosting smudged slightly on one side. A cheap cupcake from a gas station, a single green candle bought in a pack of 24 for $2, and a young woman singing happy birthday to herself in a dark kitchen at midnight. In Sienna's mind, memories came rushing back like a flood. Last year's birthday, alone in a tiny room. The year before, alone. The one before that, alone. Ever since Lily had gone, no one remembered this day. No one cared. Make a wish. Dominic's voice pulled her back to the present. A real one this time. Sienna closed her eyes, and in the darkness behind her lids she saw Lily's face, 16 years old, smiling bright, with eyes that were just like her own. Her little sister, the girl she had promised to protect, the girl she had failed. "I miss you, Lily," she whispered inside her own head. "I hope you are happy in a place I can never reach." She blew out the candle. A thin ribbon of smoke rose and unraveled into the shadows. When she opened her eyes, Dominic was still there, still watching her with that unreadable expression, as if she were an equation he was trying to solve, as if she were something he had never seen before. "Go to bed," he said, his voice still low but no longer edged with the same icy chill. Tomorrow, you will have breakfast with me." Sienna parted her lips to refuse, to say that she was only the help, that it would be inappropriate, that she didn't belong at his table. But no words came. Under that gaze, all she could do was nod. Dominic turned and walked away, the leather of his Italian shoes making no sound at all on the granite floor, as if he truly were a ghost, a bringer of death moving noiselessly through the night. The kitchen door closed behind him, and at last Sienna remembered to breathe. She stood alone in the kitchen, now swallowed in darkness, her fingers drifting without thought to the locket hidden beneath her uniform. Lily's photograph lay inside, cold against her skin, as it had every night and every day for the past 3 years. She didn't understand what had just happened. She didn't understand why the Grim Reaper of New York had lit a candle for a nameless maid. She didn't understand why her heart was still pounding so wildly. She didn't know why her hands were still trembling. But for the first time in 3 years, it was not entirely because of fear. Dominic Moretti didn't sleep. He had not truly slept in 15 years, and tonight was no exception. His office sat on the 3rd floor, the largest room in this 50-room mansion, and yet it was also the coldest. Dark oak paneled the walls, heavy charcoal velvet drapes smothered the windows, and a massive mahogany desk squatted in the center of the room like a throne. Everything was expensive, everything was luxurious, and everything was empty. The room mirrored perfectly the soul of the man who owned it. Dominic sat back in his leather chair, the glass of whiskey untouched on the desk before him. He watched the thick amber liquid roll in the bowl of the glass, and he remembered, 15 years ago, this very glass, this very whiskey, had been the last thing his father drank before he died. Don Moretti, the man who had built an empire from nothing, the only father Dominic had ever known, had fallen with 3 bullets buried in his chest on a freezing winter night. Dominic had been 22. He still remembered the smell of blood, the rasp of his father's final breath, the way the light drained slowly from the eyes of the man who had once been a mountain to him, and he remembered the name of the man who had given the order. That night, Dominic had faced 2 choices: run and live the rest of his life as a coward, or stay and become something else, something less than human. He had stayed. At 23, Dominic killed his first man. He remembered the weight and chill of the gun in his hand. He remembered the face of the man who had ordered his father's death when he realized that death was now coming for him. He remembered the crack of the shot, and then the silence that followed. From that night on, Dominic Moretti ceased to exist, and death was born. He froze every feeling, buried every hint of weakness, and turned himself into a flawless machine. No fear, no hesitation, no mercy. For 15 years he had built his empire on the blood and bones of his enemies. For 15 years he had ruled at the summit of New York's underworld, and no one had dared challenge him. For 15 years he had felt nothing but an endless, echoing emptiness. But tonight something was different. Dominic rose and walked to the window. Manhattan sprawled beneath him, millions of lights glittering like fallen stars. The city never slept, and neither did he. Yet instead of thinking about business, about the enemies lurking in the shadows, about the deals waiting to be struck, his mind kept circling back to that dark kitchen at midnight. The girl, hair the color of reddish-brown honey in the candlelight, storm-colored gray-blue eyes, that trembling voice in the dark, singing happy birthday to herself because there was no one left to sing to her. Dominic didn't understand why he had stopped. He had passed that kitchen hundreds of times in the 3 years she had worked here, and he had never once paid attention to a single member of the staff. They were ghosts, invisible cogs that kept the house running. But tonight he had paused. He had listened, and he had done something even he could not explain. He had relit the candle for her. When had he last done anything without a reason Dominic could not remember? Every action was calculated. Every move served a purpose. Yet there had been no logic in that small gesture. He drew out his phone and dialed a familiar number. Marco picked up after the second ring, his voice still rough with sleep but alert in an instant, the instinct of a man who had lived too long in the dark. "Boss, the maid, Sienna Brooks," Dominic said, his tone flat, stripped of all feeling. "Find out everything about her." There was a heartbeat of silence on the other end. Marco was surprised. Dominic knew. But Marco was loyal and he never asked questions. "Understood, boss. You will have a report in the morning." Dominic ended the call and turned back to the window. Manhattan still shimmered below, indifferent to all the tragedies unfolding in its heart. He had built this empire on control, on knowing everything and feeling nothing. But tonight a woman with storm-colored gray-blue eyes had looked at him as if he were only a man. Not death, not a monster, just a man. And Dominic Moretti had no idea what to do with that. The first light of morning slipped through the thin curtain, and woke Sienna from a shallow, broken sleep, and she lay still on the narrow bed, staring up at the ceiling, thinking for the first few seconds that the night before had only been a strange dream of darkness, and a lone candle, and a pair of eyes black as pitch that seemed to see straight through to the raw core of her. But when her fingers rose and found the cold locket resting against her chest, she knew that none of it had been a dream at all. Dominic Moretti had seen her. Death himself had seen her. Sienna pushed herself up, dragged on her familiar uniform, twisted her hair into its usual tight knot, and tried to move through the morning as if nothing had changed, scrubbing and polishing and slipping through the corridors like a ghost. She told herself that everything would be fine, that surely the master of the house had already forgotten the strange encounter in the darkened kitchen, that she could retreat into the safety of being invisible the way she had for the past 3 years. But fate was not interested in leaving her alone. The sound of soft footsteps approached from behind, and the warm, low voice of Mrs. Eleanor made her freeze in place. "Sienna, Mr. Moretti has requested your presence in the dining room." Her heart seemed to stop for a beat and then slam back into motion twice as fast as normal. She turned and looked at the 62-year-old housekeeper, seeing a shadow of concern in the older woman's eyes. Mrs. Eleanor watched her with a look Sienna could not quite read, a look that held neither comfort nor warning. "Have I done something wrong, ma'am?" Sienna asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know, child," Mrs. Eleanor answered. "But don't keep him waiting." Sienna followed the housekeeper down the long, seemingly endless hallway, every step feeling like a step toward her own execution. She was certain she was about to be dismissed. Perhaps he had decided that her presence in his kitchen at midnight had been an unforgivable breach of some rule she didn't know, that her very existence near him had been an insult. She would lose her job, her bed, the fragile shelter she had managed to hold on to, and once again she would be left with nothing at all. The dining room door swung open, and Sienna had to fight not to stop and stare. The room stretched out before her, vast and formal, a long oak table that could comfortably seat 20 people, crystal chandeliers glittering overhead, and pale morning light pouring in through tall windows that rose from floor to ceiling. At the head of the table, alone, sat Dominic Moretti. Daylight was crueler than night. It stripped away what the shadows could hide. Sienna saw the fine lines of exhaustion etched into his sharply cut face, the faint bruised smudges under his dark eyes, the strain at the corners of his mouth. He was dressed in black, as always, but in the sun he looked less like a legend and more like a man who had not truly slept in many years. "Sit, eat," his voice carried down the length of the table. Not a suggestion, not an invitation, but an order. Sienna hesitated for a heartbeat, and then moved toward a chair 5 seats away from him, far enough to feel safe yet close enough to obey. She sat with her gaze fixed on the white porcelain plate before her, hands still, back straight, trying not to draw any more attention than she already had. Closer, she lifted her eyes and found his gaze on the distance between them, displeasure shadowing his features. Sienna swallowed, rose again, and shifted to a chair only 2 seats away, an unspoken compromise between them. He said nothing more, only inclined his head slightly. The servants brought in the food, and Sienna had to fight the urge to blink in disbelief at the spread laid out before her. Eggs Benedict crowned with smoked salmon, slices of French toast glossy with truffle butter, fresh fruit cut and arranged with the precision of an artist, orange juice squeezed by hand and served in crystal glasses that caught the light. All of it together probably cost more than she made in a month. And in her mind, side by side with this lavishness, rose the picture of last night's gas station cupcake, its frosting mashed on one side, the cheap little green candle leaning in the middle. The contrast made her want to laugh or weep, and she could not quite tell which. "What is your full name?" Dominic asked, his dark eyes resting steadily on her. "Sienna Marie Brooks, sir." "Where are you from?" "Boston, sir." "How long have you worked here?" 3 years, sir." Her answers were short, precise, her gaze still lowered to her plate, her fingers twisting the napkin in her lap until the fabric bit into her skin. She tried to shrink herself down, to become as small and harmless as possible. 3 years, Dominic repeated, his voice low, sharp with suspicion. "I know everything that happens in this house. I know when a guard is 10 seconds late. I know when a file is moved an inch. Yet I have never seen you. How is that possible?" Sienna looked up then, and this time she forced herself to meet his eyes. Her hands were trembling under the table, but her voice was steady. "Because I memorized your rhythm, sir," she answered softly. "I know the sound of your footsteps on the stairs, so I know when to vanish into a side room. I know you drink your coffee at 6 a.m., so I clean this room at 4 a.m. and leave before the sun rises. I know you hate the smell of lavender, so I never use it on the days you work from home." Dominic went still. The air in the room seemed to tighten. He wasn't just looking at a maid anymore. He was looking at someone who had studied him. "You didn't just hide," he said, a strange light entering his pitch-black eyes. "You evaded me. In your world, Mr. Moretti," Sienna whispered, "you only notice the things that are wrong, the things that are out of place. So I made sure I was perfect. I made sure I was nothing more than air." Dominic leaned back, studying her as if she were a riddle he had just begun to solve. Why? Why go to such lengths to be a ghost? Silence stretched between them. Sienna knew she ought to lie, to offer some innocuous simple explanation, something ordinary. But under that cutting gaze, the truth rose up and would not be pushed back down. Because invisible people don't get hurt, the words hung between them like a confession. Dominic didn't respond, only watched her with an expression she could not decipher. He should have dismissed her. He should have gone back to the comfort of forgetting she existed at all. But Dominic realized that he wanted to know what had taught her that disappearing was the safest way to survive. Mrs. Eleanor Vance had lived through too much to be easily surprised. At 62 years of age, with 15 years of service to the Moretti family behind her, she had witnessed blood spilled and loyalties shattered, had watched men fall and empires crumble. She had stood in the shadows on the night Don Moretti was killed, had seen the 22-year-old boy kneeling beside his father's body, his hands shaking and slick with blood, his eyes fractured with a grief too deep to put into words. She had watched him rise from that night, and she had watched him die by inches over the 15 years that followed. The Dominic Moretti of 37 bore almost no resemblance to the young man she had once known. This man was as cold as ice, as ruthless as steel, and as empty as a grave. She had long since abandoned the hope that he would ever truly live again, that he would be anything more than a breathing monument to loss. And yet that morning Eleanor saw something she had thought she would never see. Dominic Moretti invited a maid to breakfast. She stood in the corner of the dining room, unnoticed as always, observing as she had done for so many years. The girl sat there, small and thin in her black uniform, reddish-brown hair twisted into a neat knot, her eyes lowered to her plate as if she were afraid to look up at anyone. Sienna Brooks. Eleanor knew the girl, had watched her work for 3 years, as silent and efficient as a shadow. She had never truly paid attention, and no one else in the house had either. That, she now realized, was exactly what the girl had wanted. Her invisibility was not weakness, it was armor. Eleanor had seen that look before in the eyes of people who had lost too much, people who had been beaten down by life so many times that they had learned to vanish in order to avoid the next blow. As Eleanor stood there, her mind slid back to Dominic at 20, before tragedy struck. He had once known how to laugh, his smile bright, his eyes alive, his voice rich with the excitement of plans for the future. He had once loved life, once believed in the possibility of goodness. Then his father died, and that smile had died with him. Eleanor could not remember the last time she had seen Dominic truly smile. But that morning, when he looked at the girl with the reddish-brown hair, she saw something move in his eyes. It was not a smile, not yet, but it was a flicker of light, small and fragile, like a candle flame in the path of a strong wind. Still, it was there. After breakfast, Eleanor found Sienna in the hallway, the girl hurrying toward the east wing of the house where the staff quarters were tucked away. "Sienna," she called gently. The girl stopped and turned, and Eleanor saw alertness spring up in those storm-colored gray-blue eyes, a wary tension like a wild creature poised to bolt. "Yes, Mrs. Vance." "Are you all right, child? How did it go?" Eleanor asked, her voice as soft as the one she used with frightened children. Sienna pressed her lips together, and Eleanor could see her weighing the words she would allow herself to say. "I am all right, Mrs. Vance. Thank you." It was a perfect answer, polite and brief and entirely empty. But Eleanor had lived too long to be fooled by perfect answers. She looked into those gray-blue eyes and saw the truths the girl was trying so hard to hide. The pain, the absence, the weight carried by someone who had borne the world alone for far too long. Yet beneath all of that, Eleanor saw something else as well, a small, stubborn flame that refused to go out. This girl was not completely dead inside, no matter how many times life had tried to kill her. "If you need anything," Eleanor said slowly, "come to me." Sienna stared at her for a long moment, as if she could not quite believe what she had just heard, and then she nodded, a small, quick dip of her head, and turned away. Eleanor watched the slight figure disappear down the corridor. She had served the Moretti family through bloodshed and betrayal. She knew danger when she saw it, but as she remembered the way Dominic had looked at Sienna, She thought that perhaps the greatest danger in this house was not violence or treachery. The most dangerous thing of all might be hope. In the days that followed that breakfast, Sienna tried to slip back into the invisible life she had carved out for herself, rising early, working hard, keeping her head bowed when she passed other people, and forcing herself not to think about those eyes black as pitch that had looked straight through her. She told herself that everything would return to normal, that the master of the house would forget her the way he had forgotten her for 3 years, that she could go on existing in the hidden corners of this mansion without anyone really seeing her. But Dominic Moretti didn't give her that chance. On the first day, she was polishing the windows in the library when the door opened, and she turned and almost dropped her cloth when she saw him come in, tall and dark in a black suit, as if the night itself had taken on a human shape. He didn't look at her, simply crossed to the shelves, took down a book, and settled into the armchair by the window. Sienna finished her work as quickly as she could and slipped out, her heart hammering in her chest. On the second day, she was cleaning the east sitting room when he appeared again, this time carrying a laptop, sitting on the sofa, and beginning to work, his fingers moving in a steady rhythm over the keys, and though she tried to hurry, tried to make herself smaller, she could feel his gaze drift to her now and then. On the third day, as she dusted the paintings along the second-floor corridor, she heard those now familiar footsteps, and he passed by, pausing for a single heartbeat, as if he were about to speak, then walking on without a word. Sienna knew this was no coincidence. For 3 years she had worked in this house, and in all that time Dominic Moretti had never used the library in the daytime, had never brought his work into the east sitting room, had never walked the second-floor hall while she was assigned to it. He was seeking her out. The thought left her both frightened and confused. She tried to avoid him, rearranging her cleaning schedule, moving more quickly through her tasks, but somehow he always seemed to know where she would be. And gradually, in those brief, charged encounters, Sienna found herself watching him in turn. She noticed the way he read, utterly focused, his brow drawn just slightly together, the way his fingers sometimes traced along the edge of a page. She noticed the way he spoke on the phone, his voice cold and authoritative, his orders clipped and final, leaving no space for disagreement. Yet what held her attention most were the moments when he believed no one was watching. The way he stood at a window with his hands in his pockets, his dark eyes empty and far away, as if he were staring into another world that no one else could reach. In those moments he no longer looked like death. He looked like a man whose loneliness had sunk into his bones. 1 week after that fateful breakfast, Sienna was in the library, rearranging the books. It was her favorite task, to touch the worn leather covers, to breathe in the scent of paper and ink, to lose herself for a few stolen moments in the worlds the stories offered. She didn't hear the door open, didn't hear footsteps behind her. Only when that low voice sounded right at her back did she flinch so hard she almost dropped the book in her hands. "You like books?" Not a question, a quiet statement. Sienna turned, her fingers tightening on the spine she held. Dominic was standing there, no more than 2 steps away, those black eyes fixed on her with a look she could not read. "I am only shelving them, sir," she stammered, her cheeks burning. "I have seen you reading," he said, his tone even and unhurried. "Last week, when you believed no one was watching." Her heart seemed to stop. She had stolen minutes in this room, on quiet afternoons when she was sure she was completely alone, reading while the dust motes drifted in the slanting light. She had not known anyone had seen. She had not known he had seen. "I am sorry, sir. I should not have." "Which one is your favorite?" he cut in, dismissing her apology without the slightest interest. Sienna hesitated. She could lie, could toss out the name of any book, could try to wriggle free of this strange conversation. But under that gaze, there was nothing she could do but tell the truth. "Jane Eyre," she whispered. Dominic watched her for a long moment, his dark eyes giving away nothing at all. Then he nodded once, turned, and left the room. The library door closed behind him, and Sienna stood alone between the towering shelves, wondering why she had answered him honestly, and why, when he was gone, the room suddenly felt emptier than before. Another week slid past after that meeting in the library, and Sienna still could not quite shake the memory of the way he had looked at her when she spoke the title of her favorite book, as if those 2 soft words meant something to him, as if she had revealed a secret even she didn't fully understand. She tried not to dwell on it, forcing herself to think of chores, of schedules, of the endless small tasks that kept the house breathing, yet every time she passed the library door, her pulse quickened. That afternoon she was polishing the 3rd-floor hallway, near the master's office, a part of the house she usually avoided. But this was the assigned day for that corridor, and she had no choice, so she moved swiftly and quietly, intent on finishing before anyone noticed her presence. She was bent over the baseboards when she heard a door open. She looked up, and her heart stumbled when she saw Dominic Moretti standing there, once again in that familiar black suit, his eyes locked directly on her. "Come with me." 2 words. No explanation, no reason offered, only a command. Sienna rose, laid the cloth carefully on the floor, and followed without asking anything at all. She didn't know why, but there was something in his voice that made refusal impossible. Something that might have been pure authority, or curiosity, or something else entirely that she didn't dare to name. Dominic led her through corridors she knew by heart, then turned into a corner she had never really noticed. Behind a hanging tapestry was a narrow door, and beyond it a spiral staircase of black wrought iron. In 3 years she had never known it existed. They climbed, step by step, the stairs coiling upward toward light. Sienna felt a faint breeze coming from above, carrying the sweet scent of flowers she could not yet identify. At the top, Dominic stopped before an old wooden door, its surface worn with time but still solid under his hand. He glanced at her once, then pushed it open. Warm, golden light poured through, and Sienna had to narrow her eyes for a moment. When she stepped through after him, the words were knocked out of her. A garden spread out around them. No, not just a garden. It was a small piece of heaven, suspended above the chaos of New York. The roof of the Moretti mansion had been transformed into a green oasis, beds of star-white jasmine bursting into bloom everywhere she looked, their sweetness thick in the soft afternoon air. Strings of lights were strung along the railings and twined through climbing vines, tiny points that would glow like fallen stars once the sun dipped below the horizon. A simple oak bench waited in one corner, positioned to face the wide-open view of Manhattan, the skyscrapers rising like silent giants in the mellow wash of the coming evening. A light wind brushed past, carrying the blend of jasmine and city, something at once familiar and impossibly distant. Sienna stood frozen, unable to move her feet, unable to drag her eyes away. She had lived in New York nearly 10 years, had grown used to concrete and steel, to sirens and horns and neon glare. She had forgotten that beauty could look like this. "This place is beautiful," she whispered, her throat tight for reasons she could not fully name. Dominic stood beside her, his gaze turned toward the city. "I built it 5 years ago. No one has ever seen it." Sienna turned to him in shock. 5 years. He had kept this world hidden for 5 years, and now he was showing it to her, a nameless maid he had only truly noticed 2 weeks earlier. "Why show it to me?" she asked, the question barely more than breath. He was silent for a long time, not looking at her, his eyes still on the skyline as if the answer might be etched in glass and stone. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual. "Because you are the only person in this house who doesn't want anything from me." The words hung between them, heavy and aching in a way Sienna had not expected. She looked at him, at the man who ruled New York's underworld, and she saw his solitude, the isolation of someone who possessed everything and yet had no one, the loneliness of a man surrounded by people who wanted his money, his power, his protection, but never simply wanted him, only him, and nothing else. She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing, standing beside him in the quiet, both of them looking out over the city as it began to slide toward evening. The breeze moved gently through the jasmine, the scent wrapping around them, and in that moment Sienna forgot who he was supposed to be and who she was supposed to be. For a little while there were only 2 people, standing together in a secret garden between earth and sky. She had spent 3 years building walls around herself, stone by careful stone, but in his hidden sanctuary, wrapped in light and jasmine and the soft hum of the city below, Sienna felt something stir inside her that she had not felt in many years. It was the fragile, shimmering sense that the world might still hold a little bit of magic. From that night on, the garden in the sky became the place where they met, with no arrangement spoken aloud, no promise given, nothing agreed upon in words. And yet every evening, when the mansion sank into silence and the servants had disappeared into their rooms, Sienna found herself climbing the spiral stairs, pushing open the old wooden door, and stepping into that small world of soft lights and jasmine. Sometimes she arrived first and sat on the oak bench, and a few minutes later she would hear his footsteps behind her. Sometimes she opened the door and found him already there, standing at the railing and looking out over the city as if he had been waiting for her all night. They never discussed it, never named what they were doing. They simply accepted it as part of the rhythm of their lives, natural as breathing. Their conversations began in small, scattered pieces, about the weather, about how Manhattan looked different when you saw it from above, about the books Sienna had read. Dominic asked many questions and Sienna answered with few words, but slowly she began to say more. She told him about Boston, about autumn in New England when the leaves turned blazing red and gold, about the books that had changed the way she saw the world. She didn't speak of Lily, not yet, but she spoke of other things, small fragments of a life she had thought she had buried long ago. And strangely, with each fragment she gave away, she felt a little lighter. One night, about a week after she first came to the garden, Dominic arrived with a bottle of red wine and 2 crystal glasses. He sat on the bench, set the bottle and the glasses between them, and began to open it. Sienna looked at the glass in front of her, the string lights catching on the clear surface until it shimmered. "I don't drink wine, sir," she said softly. Dominic paused and looked at her for a moment, then slid the glass toward her. "Then just hold it. You don't have to do anything you don't want to do." The simple sentence froze her in place. No one had ever spoken to her that way. All her life she had done what others wanted, what circumstances forced her to do, what was necessary in order to survive. No one had ever given her a choice. No one had ever told her she was allowed to say no. She picked up the glass and let it rest in her hand, feeling the cool smoothness of the crystal against her skin. Dominic poured wine into his own glass, took a slow sip, and they sat together in quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't press or strain, that felt oddly comfortable, as if they had known one another for a long time. "How is your work?" he asked after a while. Sienna told him small, ordinary things, about how the morning light fell through the windows of the east sitting room, about the painting in the second-floor hallway that she liked best, about Mrs. Eleanor and the stories she told of the house and its past. None of it was important, yet Dominic listened as if she were sharing state secrets. Then, for the first time, Sienna turned a question back on him. "And your work?" "Sir?" she asked, her voice so low the breeze almost carried it away. Dominic was silent for a moment. Then he smiled, a quiet, brief curve of his mouth that softened the sharp lines of his face. "I make problems disappear." Sienna understood the truth behind that simple phrase. She knew who he was, knew the rumors whispered about death, about the people who had angered him and were never seen again. She ought to be afraid, she ought to run. Yet here, in this secret garden, with the scent of jasmine and the soft glow of the lights, fear didn't come. She saw only a lonely man, reaching toward another human being in the only way he knew. They talked about everything and nothing, about the city beneath them, about the stars they could not see because of the city lights, about life and what it had taken from each of them, and somewhere in those quiet nights, Sienna forgot to keep her walls standing. On the 10th night in the garden, the air felt different, charged in a way she could not quite name, and she sensed it the moment she pushed open the old door and stepped outside. Dominic was already there on the bench, but instead of staring out at the city as he usually did, he was watching her, watching with that look that seemed to search for every crack in the defenses she had built. She sat down beside him, and for a while they said nothing, letting the wind and the fragrance of jasmine fill the space between them. Then Dominic spoke, his voice even deeper than usual. "The locket." Sienna went still. Her hand moved of its own accord to her chest, to the place where the old silver locket lay hidden beneath her clothes. "You touch it every time you are afraid, every time you are sad." "Who is inside?" The question hung between them, heavy as lead. Sienna didn't answer at once. She stared down at her hands, at the fingers that had begun to tremble, and thought about all the years she had carried this secret alone. 3 years in this house, and no one had asked, no one had cared. She had liked it that way, because to speak of it meant to relive it, and she had not been sure she could survive that. Yet sitting here beside the man she was supposed to fear, Sienna discovered that she wanted to tell him. For the first time in 3 years, she wanted someone to know. "My sister," she whispered, her voice close to breaking. Her name was Lily. And then the words came. She told him about the Christmas Eve 9 years ago, when her family was driving home after dinner at her grandmother's house, when she was 18 and Lily was 10, curled up beside her in the back seat, half asleep with her head on Sienna's shoulder. And then the blaze of oncoming headlights, the scream of a horn, the world spinning out of control. She told him about waking up in the hospital, about the scar on her wrist, about the way the nurse held her hand and told her that her parents had not survived, and about Lily, the small sister who sat beside her the whole time, eyes swollen but dry, clutching her hand as if letting go would mean losing her too. She told him about the years that followed, about leaving college to raise her sister, about holding down 3 jobs at once, about the sleepless nights, about dinners she gave up so Lily could eat, about trying to be mother and father and the entire world for a 10-year-old girl who suddenly had only her. Then she told him about Derek, the man she had loved for 4 years, who had promised to stay, to help her care for Lily, to build a future with them both, and how one morning, just after Lily was diagnosed with a heart condition, and she learned she needed $80,000 for surgery, Derek disappeared. He vanished with all $15,000 she had managed to save, with the borrowed money, with every fragile hope she had clung to. Her voice began to shake, tears sliding free, but she didn't stop. She told him about Lily's last 6 months, about the way her sister faded, about the way Sienna did everything she could, selling her own blood, borrowing from anyone who would lend, pleading with charities, and never quite reaching enough. She told him about the final night in the cold hospital room, Lily in her arms, 16 years old and pale and fragile as a leaf about to fall. She looked at me. Sienna choked out, tears running hot down her face, and she said, "I love you, Sienna. Don't cry." Then she closed her eyes, and she never opened them again. She wept, truly wept, for the first time in 3 years in front of another human being. Harsh, broken sobs and a flood of tears she had held back for far too long, spilling out of her like water from a shattered dam. "I promised I would protect her. I promised," she whispered between sobs. "I promised Lily I would always be there, and I broke that promise. I let her die." Dominic said nothing at first. He reached out and took her shaking hand in his grip firm and steady, like an anchor in a storm. His hand was warm and strong, the hand of a man who had killed, who had destroyed, who made an entire empire tremble. Yet in that moment it was the gentlest thing she had ever felt. "You didn't break your promise," he said quietly, his voice low but as unyielding as forged steel. "You fought for her until the very last moment. That is not failure, that is love." Sienna stared at his hand, wrapped around hers, at the hand the world feared, and understood that in this single, fragile instant it was the only thing keeping her from drowning. The next night Sienna climbed to the garden in the sky, with her eyes still faintly swollen from the tears she had shed, not knowing whether Dominic would be there, not knowing whether he would even want to see her after she had laid bare the ugliest wounds of her soul. But when she pushed the door open, he was already sitting on the familiar bench, a glass of wine in his hand, his gaze turned out toward the city, and she sat down beside him, and for a long moment they simply shared the quiet together. Then Dominic spoke, his deep voice folding into the wind. "You have shared your ghosts. It is only fair that I share mine." Sienna turned to him, startled, because Dominic Moretti, the man the whole of New York called Death, the man who never revealed anything of himself, was opening himself to her. He kept his eyes on the skyline as he spoke, as if he didn't quite dare to look at her while he said these things. "My father was Don Moretti. You have probably heard that name." Sienna dipped her head in a small nod. Who in New York had not heard of Don Moretti, the legend who had built an empire from nothing, the Italian immigrant who had arrived in America with only a few dollars in his pocket and died with an entire city at his feet? "My father grew up in poverty in Sicily. He came here when he was 18, with nothing but his will. He built everything you see." Dominic gestured toward the world glittering below them, out of darkness, with blood, with things most people would never dare to imagine. He paused and took a sip of wine. "I grew up in that world. A world of meetings at midnight, of men who carried guns, of secrets that could never survive in the light. But my father," his voice softened for a heartbeat, "my father always tried to shield me from the worst of it. He wanted something different for me, something ordinary. He sent me to the best schools, hoping I would become a lawyer, a doctor, anything but what he was." A bitter laugh slipped from Dominic's throat, but fate had other plans. He fell silent for a moment and Sienna saw his jaw tighten, the tendons in his neck standing out. "That night I was 22. I had just graduated from college, thinking about the future, about what I wanted to do with my life. Then I got the call." His voice went colder, more distant, as if he were describing a stranger's story. "One of my father's most trusted partners betrayed him. 3 bullets to the chest. By the time I arrived, he was already on the floor, blood everywhere. He died in my arms." Sienna saw the hand holding his glass clench so hard the knuckles turned white, and she wanted to reach out to him, to offer comfort, but she knew he needed to finish. "After that night I had 2 choices," he said quietly. "Run and live as a coward, let my father's empire collapse, let the men who murdered him win, or stay and become whatever I had to become in order to survive." He turned his face toward her then, and his eyes were deep and dark and full of shadows. "I killed my first man at 23, the one who ordered my father's death. Sienna said nothing, only listened, without judgment, without the fear she knew she was supposed to feel. "I don't regret it," Dominic said, his tone as hard as steel. "He deserved to die. But after that night, something in me died with him. I turned into a machine. No feelings, no hesitation, no mercy. I became what I had to be in order to survive. Death, a monster." Silence settled over the garden, soft and heavy. Sienna looked at him, at the man beside her whose shoulders were bowed beneath the weight of 15 years of darkness. "Do you regret it?" she asked gently. Dominic was quiet a long time, his eyes lost somewhere far beyond the city. "I regret that I forgot how to be anything else," he answered at last, and that answer hurt more than any confession of guilt could have. Sienna looked at him, and she didn't see a monster. She didn't see death. She saw a young man of 22 who had been forced to strip away his own humanity in order to live, a man who had sacrificed everything, even his own soul, to protect what his father had built. "You are not a monster," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You are a man who did what he had to do. There is a difference." Dominic turned his gaze back to her, and in those black eyes Sienna saw something she had never seen there before: surprise, gratitude, and deep within them a small, fragile flicker of hope, because no one had ever looked at Dominic Moretti and seen anything but death. Yet this woman with storm-colored eyes and a shattered heart had somehow glimpsed the man still living beneath the mask he had worn for so long. 2 weeks had passed since that fateful birthday night, and Sienna's life had shifted in ways she could never have imagined. Every morning she sat beside Dominic at the long dining table, no longer 5 chairs away, or even 2, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. And every evening she climbed the secret stairs to the hidden garden where he would already be waiting, and that steady rhythm had become a quiet music she had not known she needed. Dominic had changed too. He held fewer late-night meetings, came home earlier, and the cold, commanding phone calls that once went on for hours were now shorter, as if he were eager to finish and turn toward something else. Marco, his right-hand man, noticed. Sienna saw the way he looked at his boss with barely concealed astonishment, but he never asked a single question, because no one asked death anything. That night the rain came down over New York as if the sky itself were weeping. Sienna stood at the window of her tiny room, watching the water streak down the glass, and she thought of the garden. Surely no one would be there tonight. Surely Dominic would remain in his warm office, not out in the storm. Yet a restless pull would not let her be. She took the old umbrella from the corner and started up the stairs. When she pushed open the wooden door, wind and rain struck her full in the face, and then she saw him. Dominic stood in the middle of the garden, in the pounding downpour, with no umbrella and no coat, rain running over his face and soaking his black suit, and still he didn't move. He simply stood there, staring up into the black sky as if searching for something only he could see. Sienna didn't stop to think. She snapped open the umbrella and ran to him, her bare feet stinging against the wet stone. "You will get sick," she shouted, her voice torn by the wind. Dominic turned and shock flickered clearly across his features when he saw her standing there, holding the small umbrella aloft, trying to shelter them both. "You came, in this weather." Not a question, but a statement threaded with astonishment. "I was worried," Sienna whispered, and as she spoke she realized it was true. She had been worried. She had not been able to sit quietly in her room knowing he might be out here alone under the storm. They stood very close under the small circle of shelter, close enough that Sienna could feel the heat of his body through the layers of soaked cloth. Rain fell around them like a silver curtain, shutting out the rest of the world and leaving only this narrow space that held the two of them. Dominic looked down at her, his dark eyes fathomless and unreadable. Then he lifted his hand slowly, carefully, as if he were afraid of startling her, and his fingers brushed her cheek, wiping away a trail of rain. Her skin burned where he touched her. His hand didn't withdraw. His fingers moved along the delicate line of her face, from her cheek down to her jaw, pausing there as he tipped her chin gently up, and Sienna forgot how to breathe, her heart pounding wildly, her blood roaring in her ears. She knew she ought to step back, to run, to remember exactly who he was and who she was. But she didn't want to move at all, didn't want him to stop. The moment stretched, long and fragile, the two of them standing in the rain with their eyes locked and not a single word between them, until at last, as if waking from a dream, Sienna jerked back. "I have to go," she stammered, thrust the umbrella into his hand, and ran, bolting through the wooden door, down the spiral stairs, back to her room where she slammed the door and leaned against it, breath coming in sharp bursts, her heart still battering her ribs as if it might break free. She had not run because she was afraid of him. She had run because she was afraid of herself, afraid of how desperately she had wanted to stay. The next day, Sienna did everything she could to avoid Dominic, waking earlier than usual, taking assignments in the farthest corners of the house from his office, and when breakfast time came, she pretended to be occupied with work downstairs, because she had no idea how to face him after the previous night, no idea what to say about that moment in the rain, about the way she had turned and run like a coward. But when she returned to her room in the afternoon, something was waiting for her on the bed, a small box covered in black velvet, elegant and silent, with no letter, no note, nothing to say where it had come from. And yet Sienna knew there was only one person who could have placed it there without anyone else noticing. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, feeling the delicate weight of it in her palm, and when she lifted the lid, her breath caught in her throat. Resting on white satin lay a fine gold chain, slender and beautifully made. But it was not the gold that stole the air from her lungs, it was the pendant, a golden lily, carved with such careful detail that every petal seemed thin and delicate as if it might flutter in a real breeze, catching the light in tiny glints. Lily, her sister. Tears rose before Sienna could stop them. She sank down onto the bed, fingers gripping the box, and began to cry. Not for the cost of the necklace, which was surely more than anything she had ever owned, but for the meaning wrapped inside it, because only one person in the world knew about Lily, only one person had sat beside her in the dark and listened while she poured out the story of her little sister, and that person had given her this, a way to carry Lily with her always, not only in the old silver locket with its faded photograph, but in something new and beautiful, something that whispered of hope. Sienna fastened the chain around her neck and felt the cool weight of the pendant settle against her skin, right beside the old silver locket. She didn't remove the locket, she never removed it, but now, beside Lily's picture, there was a golden flower bearing her name, past and present, pain and hope resting together over her heart. That night Sienna climbed to the garden, still unsure of what she would say, still unable to find words big enough to hold what she was feeling. Dominic was already there, seated on the oak bench, staring out over the city as he always did, and he didn't turn when he heard her footsteps, but she knew he was aware of her. She sat beside him, and they were quiet. And she didn't say thank you, because thank you was far too small for what he had given her. No words seemed large enough. Instead, she did the one thing she had wanted to do for a long time but had never dared. She leaned her head gently against his shoulder. Dominic went rigid and she could feel it, the way his whole body tightened like a bowstring pulled too far. And she understood that no one had ever done this to him, that no one had ever simply rested against him, trusting him, seeking comfort in him. He was death. People ran from him, they didn't run toward him. Yet slowly his body eased, his shoulders dropping, his breath evening out, and then his arm came around her shoulders, drawing her closer, holding her there as if he were afraid she might vanish if he let go. They stayed that way without speaking, while the city shimmered below them and the dim stars scattered across the New York sky. And as the night slipped by, the breeze carried the scent of jasmine around them, and still they didn't move. When the darkness began to soften from black to deep violet, and then to pale rose, when the first edges of dawn touched the horizon, they were still there, still leaning into one another. No words were needed, no explanations, only the simple fact of being there together, two lonely souls who had somehow found each other in the dark. That was the night Sienna finally admitted to herself what she had been denying for so long, that she was falling in love with the most dangerous man in New York, and the most frightening part was that she had no desire to stop. On the last night of the second week, when Sienna climbed to the garden, she sensed a difference at once. The string lights still glowed softly as always. The jasmine still scented the air. But there was something more. Music. The low, smoky sound of a saxophone drifted through the night. A slow, aching jazz melody like the whisper of the dark itself. Dominic stood by the railing with a small speaker at his feet, and when he heard her approach, he turned, and in the soft golden light, Sienna saw something she had never seen on his face before. Anticipation. Dance with me. 2 simple words, yet they rooted her to the spot. She looked at him, at the hand he held out toward her, and suddenly she laughed. A real laugh. Not the polite small curve of lips she had learned to wear as armor, but a sound that rose from somewhere deep inside her, bright and unrestrained, and she could not remember the last time she had laughed like that. "I don't know how to dance," she said, still smiling. Dominic didn't smile in return, but his eyes softened. "Then let me lead." Sienna placed her hand in his and he drew her close, one hand resting warm and steady at the small of her back, the other lifting her hand with an unexpected gentleness, and they began to move, slowly, to the flowing line of the saxophone. She had no idea what she was doing, her feet clumsy and uncertain, but Dominic guided her as if she were born to it, and gradually she relaxed, letting her head tip against his chest, closing her eyes, allowing herself to sink into the moment. His scent surrounded her, sandalwood and whiskey and something that was only him, and beneath her ear his heartbeat thudded strong and steady like a drum in the night, his hand tracing small circles on her back until she felt as though she were melting into him. The music ended, but they didn't stop, still swaying together in silence, and then she felt his fingers slide up to her chin, tilting her face upward. She opened her eyes and met his, dark and blazing with an intensity that stole her breath. "I don't know how to do this," he said, his deep voice unsteady in a way she had never heard. "I don't know how to feel. For 15 years I have forgotten what it means to be a man. But with you," he paused, his thumb stroking softly along her cheek, "with you, I want to try." Then he kissed her, gently, slowly, as if he feared she might break beneath his mouth, as if she were the most precious thing he had ever touched. For a heartbeat Sienna froze, her heart stopping, the world falling away, and then she kissed him back, tears slipping down her face, and she didn't care, winding her arms around his neck and pulling him closer as the kiss deepened. All the years of loneliness, all the nights of silent weeping, all the walls she had built crashing down at once, and she felt no fear at all, only a hungry need for more. Dominic kissed her like a drowning man discovering air, fierce and desperate. Both of them starved for this and only now realizing how empty they had been, and when at last their mouths parted, they were both breathing hard. Dominic rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed, his breath warm on her lips. "Stay with me," he whispered. "Not as a maid, as mine." Sienna closed her eyes, tears still damp on her skin, and thought of all the reasons she ought to say no, of who he was and who she was, the danger, the gulf between their worlds, but held in his arms with jasmine on the breeze and lights glittering above them, none of those reasons seemed to matter anymore. "Yes," she whispered. She said yes, and in that fragile, perfect instant, neither of them knew that darkness was already watching from the shadows. Vincent Caruso was the kind of man darkness itself seemed born to serve, 45 years old with salt and pepper hair slicked back from a hard face and steel-gray eyes that never softened. A man who had clawed his way up from the filthy alleys of Brooklyn to become one of the most feared Mafia bosses in the south of Manhattan. But being feared was not enough. He wanted more. He wanted everything, and the one thing standing between him and everything was Dominic Moretti. For months Vincent had been studying death, watching and waiting for a crack, a weakness, anything he could exploit. But Dominic Moretti was like a fortress without windows. No family, no lover, no friends, only business and power, until recently. Vincent's informants had begun to whisper about a change. The master of the Moretti estate was holding fewer late-night meetings, coming home earlier, and there was a girl, a seemingly unremarkable maid, who had somehow caught his attention. Vincent had laughed when he heard that, the dry, satisfied laugh of a fox catching the scent of a lamb. The meeting of the Mafia bosses took place in an upscale Italian restaurant in the heart of Manhattan, the kind of place ordinary people had to reserve months in advance, but for men like them the entire restaurant was closed for a single dinner. 7 men sat around the long table, each one the lord of a territory, an empire, an invisible army, and at the head of the table, as always, sat Dominic Moretti, Death himself, with his familiar cold composure, his gaze gliding over the faces around him like a hawk weighing its prey. The meeting was tense but orderly. Negotiations over turf and money and power conducted with careful words as if they all walked a tightrope. Then Vincent spoke. "I hear Death has acquired a new little pastime," he said, his tone light as if he were commenting on the weather, though his gray eyes gleamed with danger. "A little songbird in his mansion." The air in the room turned heavy at once, dropping like a weighted blanket. No one dared to breathe. No one dared to look at Dominic. The private life of Death was a subject never touched, an unwritten rule everyone understood, and Vincent had just shattered it. Dominic didn't react. His face remained carved from stone, his black eyes giving away nothing. But Marco, seated just behind his boss, saw what no one else saw. Under the table, Dominic's hand had clenched into a fist so tight the knuckles were white. "I have no idea what you are talking about," Dominic answered, his voice calm and almost bored. "Perhaps you should check your sources." Vincent smiled, a thin razor smile. "Perhaps." The meeting moved on, But the atmosphere had shifted, because a declaration of war had been made, even if it had been wrapped in velvet. After the other bosses had left, Dominic sat in the car, his face still expressionless, until his phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number, sent through a private channel only men in their world knew. She is very beautiful, very fragile. It would be a shame if something were to happen to such a delicate little flower. Dominic's eyes darkened, no longer the cold ice that everyone knew, but a storm, a hellfire, a promise of death. He called Marco at once, his voice as sharp and cold as a drawn blade. Increase security. 24/7. She doesn't go outside alone. Not one step. Marco didn't ask why. He had served Dominic long enough to know when questions were dangerous. Understood, boss. Dominic looked out through the car window at the city rolling past in the dark. For 15 years he had survived by having no weakness. Nothing anyone could take from him. Nothing his enemies could use. Now for the first time he had something to lose, and his enemies knew it. A few days after that fateful meeting, Sienna asked permission to go out and buy flowers for the garden. The jasmine needed replenishing, and she wanted to add a few pots of lavender for more color. Dominic agreed, though she saw a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. She didn't know that Marco was following at a distance, didn't know there was a black car parked a few yards away, didn't know that every step she took was being watched. The Chelsea Flower Market was housed in an old glass structure, filled with color and scent, and Sienna wandered through the rows of blooms, her fingers brushing soft petals, feeling peaceful for the first time in years. She was bending to smell a pot of white jasmine when the air around her suddenly felt too tight. A man in a gray suit stepped directly into her personal space, trapping her against the flower display. Before she could gasp, a hand gripped her elbow hard, not enough to bruise, but enough to warn. "Smile, Miss Brooks," a voice hissed in her ear, smooth as silk and cold as ice. "Don't look at me, look at the flowers." Sienna froze, her heart slamming against her ribs. She tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Marco stiffen 20 feet away. He had seen. He was already moving, shoving people aside, his hand reaching inside his jacket. The man beside her saw Marco coming too. He moved faster. "Dominic Moretti can't save everyone," the stranger whispered urgently. "Especially not his weakness." He jammed something into her hand, a photograph, and released her instantly. "Marco!" Sienna cried out, stumbling back as the man shoved past a group of tourists. Marco was there in a second, placing himself between Sienna and the crowd, his gun drawn just enough to be visible to a threat but hidden from the public. His eyes were wild, scanning the sea of heads. "Where is he?" Marco barked, his voice lethal. He went that way." "Into the subway entrance," Sienna stammered, clutching the crumpled photo. Marco cursed under his breath, a sharp, violent sound. He knew better than to leave her alone to chase a ghost in a crowd like this. It was a calculated move. They wanted him to chase so she would be left unguarded. He holstered his weapon and turned to her, gripping her shoulders. "Did he touch you? Are you hurt?" Sienna shook her head, her hands trembling as she looked down at the photograph the man had forced upon her. It was her, standing in the rooftop garden. "I am fine," she lied, though her voice shook. "But he left this." Marco studied her for a long moment, clearly unconvinced, but he didn't press, and they returned to the mansion in silence. Sienna said nothing to Dominic about the encounter. She didn't know exactly why. Perhaps she feared his reaction. Perhaps she didn't want to add to his burdens. Or perhaps, deep inside, she already knew what she would have to do. That night Sienna lay alone in her room and didn't climb to the garden. She stared at the dark ceiling and thought of everyone she had ever loved. Her parents, lost in a car crash she had been powerless to stop. Lily, lost because she could not earn enough money in time. Derek, who had walked away when she had needed him most. Everyone she loved either left her or was ripped away. And now she loved Dominic Moretti, the most powerful man in New York, a man whose enemies would do anything to bring him down. And she, Sienna Brooks, had become his weakness. The photograph in her pocket felt like a curse. They knew about her. They could reach her. And if they could reach her, they could use her to hurt him. "I am his weakness," she whispered into the darkness. "If anything happens to him because of me," she had lost everyone she had ever loved. She could not bear to become the reason Dominic lost everything. That night Sienna climbed to the garden as she always did, but her steps were heavier than they had ever been. And when she found Dominic sitting on the familiar bench and settled beside him, she made herself memorize every detail. The sweet breath of jasmine on the night air, the way the string lights shimmered like fallen stars scattered across the earth, The sharp lines of his face and how the warm gold of the bulbs softened the hardness there, because she knew this would be the last time. They sat in silence until Dominic, as always, was the first to sense that something was wrong. "What is it?" he asked, turning to her with dark eyes full of concern. Sienna tried to smile, but it felt like something cracking on her lips. "It is nothing. I am just tired," she answered, and the lie hurt more than anything she had ever said. But she had to say it. For him, for his safety, because she loved him too much to become the reason he fell. Dominic didn't fully believe her. She saw that in his eyes, but he didn't press. Instead, he drew her into his arms, let her rest her head against his chest, and they stayed like that until the night grew late. When she finally stood to go, he caught her hand, tugged her gently back, and pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Sleep well. I will be here when you wake." The words slid into her heart like a blade, and she nodded, afraid to speak lest her voice shatter, then walked away without looking back. She could not look back. At 3 a.m, with the mansion sunk deep in sleep and shadows filling every hall, Sienna sat up in bed. She had not slept at all, only lain on her back staring at the ceiling and counting each minute as it passed, waiting for this moment. She took a sheet of paper and a pen, and with a hand that would not stop trembling she wrote, "I am your weakness. I can't let you be destroyed because of me. I have lost everyone I have ever loved. I can't lose you as well. Please forget me. Please be safe." Tears dropped onto the page, blurring some of the words, but she didn't rewrite it. She left the letter on the small table, then lifted her hand to her throat. The golden lily pendant lay warm against her skin beside the old silver locket. She unfastened the chain, and the emptiness that rushed in when it left her body nearly brought her to her knees. She laid the necklace beside the letter, her fingertip brushing the delicate golden petals one last time. The locket she kept. Lily would go with her, as always. There was not much to pack. Sienna had arrived with almost nothing, and she would leave with almost nothing. A small suitcase, a few changes of clothes, and the locket at her throat. She stood in the doorway and let her gaze travel over the little room one last time. The room that 3 years earlier had been only a place to sleep but had somehow become home. The place where she had learned how to hope again. The place where she had found love when she had believed herself incapable of it. She drew a long breath and stepped out. The corridor was dark and silent, holding only the echo of her soft footfalls. She moved past familiar rooms, past the grand staircase with its crystal chandelier, past the heavy front doors. She didn't look back. She could not. If she turned around even once, she would never have the strength to leave. She walked into the night and left her heart behind. What she didn't know was that Dominic stood at the office window on the 3rd floor, watching. He had not slept, had felt the wrongness in the way she had looked at him that evening, the way she had seemed to be drinking in every detail as if it were the last time. And now he stood there, watching her small figure slip into the darkness, his hand clenched so tightly that his nails sliced into his skin. Blood fell in quiet drops onto the cold granite floor, but he didn't feel it. No pain of flesh could compare to the sensation of his heart breaking inside his chest. The next morning, Dominic didn't come down to the dining room. He sat in his darkened office, the curtains still drawn, the only light seeping through a narrow crack, and on the desk before him lay the letter, the shaky lines of her handwriting already branded into his memory after a single reading, and in his hand the golden lily necklace rested, cold and still. He didn't shout, he didn't smash anything, he didn't react in any of the ways people might have expected of a mafia boss who had just been abandoned, because this was not betrayal. It was something far worse. She had left because she loved him. She had left to protect him, and that was what tore him apart. Mrs. Eleanor knocked at 8 a.m. as she always did, but there was no answer. She opened the door and stepped inside and stopped dead. In 15 years of serving Dominic Moretti, she had seen him furious, had seen him icy, had seen him so ruthless that hardened enemies shook in their boots, but she had never seen him like this. Dominic sat motionless in his leather chair, staring at nothing, his face empty, the face of a man who had died but forgotten to stop breathing. The gold chain glinted in his hand, and she recognized it at once. The girl was gone. "She thinks she is protecting me," Dominic said, his voice rough as if he had not spoken in hours. "By destroying us both." Mrs. Eleanor had no words. She simply stood there, looking at the man she had come to think of as a son, and her heart ached. 3 days passed, and Dominic Moretti became a ghost in his own house. He didn't eat, the trays carried in and carried out untouched. He didn't sleep, and Mrs. Eleanor saw the office light burning through the night. He didn't attend meetings, didn't make calls, didn't give orders. The empire he had built over 15 years seemed abruptly abandoned. Marco was the first to dare to face him. On the third day, he pushed open the office door and stepped inside in defiance of every unspoken rule, and the sight before him almost drove him back. Dominic sat there unshaven, eyes sunken, looking as if he had aged 10 years in 3 days. "Boss," Marco said carefully, "the business needs you. There are decisions no one else can make." Silence stretched out. Then Dominic lifted his head, and Marco saw the black eyes hollowed out, stripped of their usual life. "Find her," Dominic said, his voice sounding as if it came from a great distance. "Don't approach her. I just need to know she is safe." Marco nodded and left. 24 hours later, he returned with news. Sienna Brooks had gone back to the old apartment in the South Bronx, the place she and her sister had lived before Lily died, a shabby flat in a dangerous neighborhood where a girl alone had no business being. But that was not the worst of it. "What else?" Dominic asked, catching the hesitation on Marco's face. Marco drew a slow breath. "Vincent Caruso. He knows she is there. His men are watching the building." In that instant, something shifted. Dominic stood for the first time in 3 days, and Marco watched the light return to his eyes, but it was not the light of hope or love. It was the light of hell, the light of death waiting to be delivered. Death had slept for 2 weeks, softened by love. But now, staring at the address in his hand, the monster woke. Anyone who dared to touch her would beg for the mercy of dying. The old apartment in the South Bronx was exactly as Sienna remembered, only worse. 3 empty years without care had turned it into a ruin of what had once been a home, the walls stained with damp and yellow patches, the sour smell of ancient pipes hanging in the air, the windows no longer shut properly. Cold wind seeped in through the gaps, carrying the shriek of car horns and the muffled arguments from the next unit. The narrow single bed was still wedged into the corner, the thin, worn mattress no different from 3 years before. Sienna curled herself on that bed, staring up at the cracked ceiling, and she remembered Lily lying here on this very mattress on nights when Sienna told stories to drown out the noise outside. She remembered Lily's laughter echoing in this cramped little room, the way her sister could find joy in the smallest things. A wildflower picked from a sidewalk, a song on the radio, a simple dinner the two of them cooked together. Lily had lived here. Lily had laughed here. Lily had loved and been loved here. And now Lily was gone. Only ghosts and noise remained, only cold walls and painful memories. Only Sienna alone, as she had always been. She closed her eyes and Dominic rose in her mind, his arms around her in the night garden, his deep voice murmuring against her ear, his scent of sandalwood and whiskey, the secret rooftop with jasmine and string lights, their first kiss under the moon, the way he had looked at her as if she were the most precious thing he had ever held. Her hand lifted to her throat without thinking, seeking the golden lily pendant, but it was no longer there. She had left it behind with her heart, with every hope she had dared to nurture. Her fingers found the old silver locket, the last thing she still had, and tears began to fall. She cried, not the quiet tears she had taught herself to shed alone over the past 3 years, but broken sobs that tore at her chest, the sound of someone who had tried to be strong for too long and finally collapsed. She cried for Lily, for her parents, for the years of loneliness and pain. She cried for Dominic, for the love she had abandoned, for the happiness she had given up. She cried for everything she had lost and everything she would never have. And even as her pillow grew wet with tears, Sienna told herself she had done the right thing. She was his weakness. She was the target his enemies could aim at. If she stayed, sooner or later they would use her to hurt him. She had lost her parents. She had lost Lily. She could not bear to be the reason Dominic lost his life or the empire he had built. "He is safer without me," she whispered into the dark, trying to convince herself. "Everyone is safer without me." Outside the window, beneath the flickering streetlight, a black car sat motionless across the street. It had been there since she arrived, but Sienna had not noticed. She was too far sunk in her own sorrow to see anything beyond it. She didn't see the figure inside the car watching the window of her apartment. She didn't know she was being watched. She believed she was protecting him. She didn't understand that by leaving, she had placed herself in more danger than ever. 5 days crawled by like 5 years. Sienna barely left the apartment, slipping out only to buy cheap food from the corner store before retreating to curl up on the old bed again. She didn't look for work, didn't call anyone, did thing but lie there staring at the ceiling and trying not to think about him, and failed miserably. On the morning of the 5th day, a knock sounded at the door. Sienna sat up, her heart racing. No one knew she was here. No one was supposed to know she was here. She walked to the door, her hand shaking as she turned the lock, and the sight on the threshold rooted her where she stood. Mrs. Eleanor Vance, in a fine wool coat and expensive leather shoes, stood in the dingy hallway with its peeling paint and stale smell, a white orchid blooming in the middle of a trash heap, out of place in every way. "Mrs. Vance," Sienna whispered, having no idea what else to say. "I didn't come to drag you back," Mrs. Eleanor said at once, as if she could feel the fear rising in the girl. "I came so you would understand." Sienna hesitated, and then opened the door wider to let her in. Mrs. Eleanor glanced around the tiny room, her eyes filled not with judgment but with sorrow. She sat on the single rickety wooden chair, and Sienna perched on the edge of the bed across from her. "Vincent Caruso," Mrs. Eleanor began, and Sienna went rigid at the name. "You know who he is?" Sienna gave a small nod. She would never forget those cold gray eyes and that razor-thin smile. "Dominic has dealt with him," Mrs. Eleanor said. "He didn't kill him, though I know he wanted to. But he has made sure Vincent Caruso will never dare lay a finger on you again. No one in that world will." Sienna could not find words. She had left to protect him, and he was still protecting her. "He is changing," Mrs. Eleanor went on gently, "because of you. He is trying to become a man worthy of the way you look at him. In 15 years of serving him, I have never seen him like this." She slipped a thick envelope from her coat pocket. "He asked me to bring you this. He says he will respect whatever choice you make." Sienna took the envelope with shaking hands. Mrs. Eleanor rose and walked toward the door, then paused without turning back. "Whatever you decide," she said softly, "know that you have changed him, and that is something I never believed possible." Then she left, closing the door and leaving Sienna alone with the envelope. For a long time Sienna could only stare at it, afraid to open it, before finally, with trembling fingers, she tore the edge of the paper. Inside were 2 things, a long handwritten letter and a photograph. She looked at the photograph first, and her breath caught. It was her, in the rooftop garden, face turned toward the lights, smiling. Not the careful, polite smile she wore as a mask, but a real smile from deep within. The smile of someone who was happy. She didn't recognize the woman in the picture. She didn't remember ever looking so alive. With tear-blurred eyes, she unfolded the letter and began to read. Dominic's handwriting was strong and decisive, but in places the strokes shook slightly as if his hand had not been steady. "You think you are my weakness. You are wrong. You are my strength. Before I met you, I was a ghost, moving through the days, building empires I didn't care about, punishing those who deserved it and those who didn't. I was good at it, and I was empty. Then I heard you sing, and something in me woke up. You don't see death. You don't see the monster everyone else sees. You see Dominic, just Dominic, the man I had forgotten I once was. I want mornings with your coffee. I want to hear you sing, not alone in the dark, but for me, in the light, where you know someone is listening. I want to take you to the place where Lily rests and hold your hand while you tell her about the man who loves her sister. I want to build a life in which you never again have to make yourself small. If you truly are happier without me, I will let you go. But if you are running because you are afraid of me, afraid of this, afraid of hope, then come home. The garden is waiting. I am waiting. I will wait forever if I have to." Sienna read the letter 3 times, her tears smearing the ink, then lifted her gaze to the dim little room around her, and back again to the photograph of the woman who had remembered how to smile. And in that moment she made her choice. Sienna didn't need to think any longer. She grabbed her old coat, slipped the letter and the photograph into her pocket, and ran for the door. Racing down the dim stairwell of the building, sprinting through streets slick with dirty yellow light, running as if her life depended on it, and perhaps it did. Her heart pounded wildly in her chest, her breath came in ragged gasps, but her feet didn't slow. She had been running away for 3 years. Tonight she ran home. When she reached the gates of the Moretti estate, she stopped for a single heartbeat, afraid they would remain closed, afraid he had shut her out of his life. But as she stepped forward, the heavy iron gates swung open on their own. He had never revoked her access. He was still waiting. Sienna ran along the gravel drive, through the front door someone had left ajar, past the familiar halls that now seemed to welcome her back, up the stairs, past the 2nd floor and the 3rd, to the hidden door behind the tapestry, and up the spiral steps that led to their heaven. When she pushed open the old wooden door, warm golden light washed over her. The string lights still shimmered, the jasmine still perfumed the air, and he was there. Dominic sat on the oak bench with his head bowed into his hands, his shoulders rounded as if he were carrying the whole world on his back. He didn't hear her footsteps, or perhaps he didn't dare to hope, but then he lifted his head, and when his black eyes met hers, Sienna saw something she would remember as long as she lived. Hope. Pure, blazing hope, pouring across the face of the man the world called death. Sienna. He spoke her name like a prayer. I am here, she whispered. She moved toward him, step by step, until she stood in front of him. You were right. I ran because I was afraid of hope, afraid of losing you the way I have lost everyone else. Dominic rose, towering above her, and she saw that his hands were shaking. Death of New York was trembling because of her. And now, he asked, his voice rough, now I choose you, if you still want me. Dominic laughed then, and it was the first smile she had ever seen that truly reached his eyes, lighting his whole face, burning away 15 years of darkness. Still want you, Sienna. I have belonged to you since the moment you blew out that candle. Then he kissed her. There were no tears this time, only love. She wrapped her arms around his neck. He held her as if he were afraid she might vanish, and they kissed in their secret garden, surrounded by lights and jasmine and the far-off stars above New York. When their mouths parted, Dominic drew the golden lily pendant from his pocket. He fastened it around her neck, his fingers brushing the charm, and Sienna felt complete. Lily's locket and Dominic's flower, past and present, pain and love, all resting together over her heart. Stay, Dominic whispered. Not as anything else, as mine. Sienna smiled, the same smile he had captured in the photograph, the smile of someone who is truly happy. Forever. 1 year later, Sienna stood in the rooftop garden with a watering can in her hand, tending the jasmine plants she and Dominic had planted together. She had changed so much in the past year. No longer thin and hollow-eyed, no longer marked by fresh threads of gray from stress. She now looked exactly like the woman in the photograph he had taken, alive and radiant. Warm hands slid around her waist from behind, and she leaned back into the familiar chest. Happy birthday, Dominic murmured against her ear. Sienna smiled and turned in his arms. That night, for the first time in many years, she didn't sing alone. She sang with him, beneath the lights and in the scent of jasmine, wrapped in love and happiness. She was no longer invisible. She was seen. She was loved. She was home. The story of Sienna and Dominic had come to a close, but the lessons it left behind would keep echoing. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is not to run away in order to protect the one we love, but to stay and allow ourselves to be loved. Sometimes the people who seem the strongest are in truth the loneliest, and all they need is someone who can see the human being behind the mask. Life can take so much from us, but it can also give us miracles, if we are willing to open our hearts. Sienna had lost her parents, her sister, her faith in love, but she found them all again in the arms of the man she had once believed could never understand her. And what about you? Have you ever felt invisible in the rush of your own life? Have you ever been so afraid of losing happiness that you wanted to run from it rather than risk the pain of watching it slip away? Share your story in the pain of defined inciting H in the rush of your own. Comments below. We would be honored to hear what lives in the deepest part of your heart. If this story has touched you, please subscribe to our channel, click like, and share this video with the people you care about. Every day we bring you heartfelt and meaningful stories, and your support is the greatest encouragement for us to continue this journey. We wish each of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with love. Remember, no matter how invisible you might feel, there is always someone out there waiting to truly see you. Thank you for staying with us to the very end. Goodbye, and we look forward to meeting you again in the next video.